Excellent. Thank you, Dan, for giving us modern history perspective. So I'm going to start where Dan ended, and I will give you some updates about the current history. And not only updates about the current history, ongoing war in Ukraine, Russian aggression, but also I will come up with some argument about the sources of the Ukrainian success. Okay. You might agree, you might disagree with this. It's not exactly my argument. Some other writers and scholars made this argument. And before I do this, I became interested in the last line which Dan mentioned when Russian Orthodox patriarchs go to Russian detachments and telling them, if you die in this war, your sins will be washed away. It reminded me something which I just read this morning about a different war. There was the most horrendous war, by the way. You know, I don't know if this current war is poised to become the most horrible war. We don't know yet. But so far, the most horrible war after 1945 was Iran-Iraqi war, which resulted in the death of 2 million people. And their Iranian ayatollahs, 1980 to 1988, similarly told these Mujahideens, Islamic rebels, that if you go and die, all your sins will be washed away, you will end up in paradise. It's something like, I don't want to draw direct parallels, but something is going on here. Anyway, let's go back to my topic. See, the title, Going Horizontal Toward Ukrainian Military Success. Let me give you a few, again, updates. Also, I will be showing maps that Ukrainian population by 1994, when the country became, by the time when the country became independent, the time when so-called Budapest Memorandum was adopted that guaranteed the borders of Ukraine, the population composition was looking like this. 72% of the population Ukrainians, 22% Russians. And if you look at this Dnieper River, so the east was more leaning toward Russia, and the easternmost part of Ukraine was Russian-speaking and infested with some, I would say, Soviet/Russian legacy. So they were linking themselves to this so-called Russian world. And as early as 1994, 95, Russian government slowly but surely started to encourage these secessionist, separatist sentiments. So it didn't happen in 2014 out of nowhere. So there was a lot of background behind this, okay? Since my time is limited, what I'm trying to tell you here is that both countries, Russian Federation and Ukraine, they came out from the Soviet tent, so to speak. They had Soviet legacy, okay? Russia had and still has a lot of corruption. Ukraine also had a lot of corruption. Russia had a lot of clans that were fighting among each other in the 1990s. Ukraine had the similar situation, okay? But something was going on that set apart these countries, okay? What was this something? First, in Russia, we see this gradual drift toward the autocratic regime. As a president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he calls it vertical of power. And he started building this vertical of power as early as 2003, okay? So he consolidated his power gradually, not overnight, of course, okay? He canceled the elections of governors in 2004, and Russians didn't object. It was hardly, it was not making any news. Everybody swallowed it, just like this, okay? So instead, he appointed 8 federal inspectors to control local governments, okay? Cracked down on local self-government, okay? Free elections were essentially shut down by 2012, when Putin made a decision to come back and to guarantee his personal power forever, okay? And the secret police, the former KGB, came to exercise a total hegemony. Okay, on the one hand, we have Ukraine, also Soviet legacy, okay? But what we had in Ukraine, it's a competition of clans, okay? Different areas, different interests, sometimes violently, sometimes non-violently, clashed with each other. There was a tug of war also between, of course, easternmost part, central part, and especially the western part, that European-oriented, Ukrainian, okay, western part. Russia started to sponsor, as I said, separatists and secessionists, okay, building this cultural background for the future interference. And finally, what came 2014, the Russian invasion. Okay, in Crimea, it came smoothly because it was a Russian majority there, a bunch of military retirees, so many of them embraced this Russian world. But in eastern part of the country, the situation was more complicated. There was a significant Ukrainian element and a Russian element. So there were a lot of fights. And central government of Ukraine, and that's where my story begins. The central government of Ukraine in 2014 was paralyzed. Okay. Let me backtrack. The central government was paralyzed, and what happened? One slide is missing, but somehow I will tell you in my own words. The void was filled by volunteer organizations. Gradually but surely, a volunteer movement started to develop. So those Ukrainians who have friends with Ukrainian friends, you might ask them and they will tell you about this nationwide volunteer movement to organize battalions, military battalions, to collect food for them, to protect the borders of the country, because army was disabled. Okay. And it was a good trend. It turned out to be a good trend. Well, the point I'm trying to make is that it eventually led to what they call decentralization reforms, 2014. Okay? Look at this slide very carefully. Okay? That's the gist of my story. Okay? So basically, out of this decentralization of power, out of these volunteer organizations, Ukrainians created a new system of local governments throughout the entire country. Territorial communities were established, which received a lot of financial independence. Okay, financial independence. They could provide public services. They reported directly to the people. Okay, and since the Russian invasion, many Ukrainians, at least to my knowledge, okay, I wasn't there at that time, but from what I read, I figured out that many Ukrainians came to defend their local governments, local areas. So they developed this sense of locality. So they took it closely to their heart, and they didn't want another outside force telling them what to do, including some Russian-speaking areas. Okay, that's what is interesting. So we have this Russian invasion actually helping to shape civic Ukrainian nationalism. I repeat, civic Ukrainian nationalism. When Russian-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking people started thinking about themselves as Ukrainians, okay, important factor. And in some interviews I heard, some Ukrainians, especially those who joined territorial defense, they said, we are not fighting for Znamenski. We are fighting for our local areas, for our self-government. It's very important. So Russians don't have this at all. So Russia moved in the opposite direction. Okay. Again, that's just to make a point. Another point, Ukrainians decentralized tactics and disaggregated ambush, hit, and run attacks crippled the Russian army. So what I'm trying to tell you that this civic life that was developed in Ukraine and still develops affected the organization of the Ukrainian military. So it's important for us to keep in mind. And I'm going to compare and contrast how Russian army organized and how Ukrainian army is organized. Look at the Russian army. Russian army organized by the vertical power, which is promoted by present Russian dictator Putin. Okay, see what struck me is huge number of generals in the Russian army. Okay, it's a sign of bureaucracy, military bureaucracy. Okay, no initiative for junior officers. Okay, until 2008 there was a conscription system that was based on hazing and informal power, so to speak, when second-year soldiers harassed and forced first-year soldiers. Okay, that's how the power was exercised in Soviet and the Russian army. Okay, second-year soldiers did the job what officers should do, you know, like controlling the life on the ground. Okay, after 2008, Putin made an attempt to do army reform. It didn't work out. It continued, but also now violence was exercised by contract soldiers because part of the Russian army was switching to contracts and officers. Because the second-year soldiers were gone because Russian draft was 1 year instead of 2 years. So somebody had to control the Russian army, to exercise their discipline. So who started doing this? Contract soldiers and officers who continued this cycle of violence. Okay, and many soldiers in the Russian army used as slave labor for officers. Okay, let's move on. Did I shut it down? Here we go. Just for you to compare and contrast. Look, U.S. has, it was hard for me to find these numbers because the number of generals is not always available. I spent 2 hours looking for this information. U.S., look, 896 generals, okay? And the total number of U.S. Army, 1,400,000. It's more than the Russian Army, right? Look at this. U.S. Army is more than the Russian Army, but has fewer generals. Okay, only North Korea. North Korea beats Russia in the number of generals. Okay, and here you can see. Yesterday evening, I found the number of generals in Ukraine: 110. It's 2019. All right. So Ukrainian military success is. Can be explained, in my view, by this process of decentralization. Okay. Ukraine applied decentralization to control and command systems. Ukrainians, when Russians invaded, started using these tactics of hit and run, and they avoided this mass, grandiose, grand formations. Remember how Russians invaded a bunch of trucks moving by the roads, and when they didn't receive orders, they didn't know where to go. Okay. Unlike Ukrainians who exactly knew where to go. Why? Because junior officers and sergeants were able to make decisions on their own. So they were given the right to make these tactical decisions, not strategic decisions, but tactical decisions. Okay. Here we go. That's where the slide that was supposed to be in the beginning. Okay. So the significance of the 2014 war experience. Look at this. So Russian invasion in the easternmost part of the country, when the central power was paralyzed, I'm going back to where I started, so gave room to this decentralization of Ukraine. So volunteer organizations, local governments stepped in to protect the country. Very important. Okay. And finally, I'm finishing my story. I'm an educator, right? So let me give you a home assignment. You know, there was a scholar who wrote this article called "The Use of Knowledge in Society." This scholar argued that dispersed knowledge in science, in military command, in social life, if you rely on many centers of power, that's how you accomplish things, you know. When you centralize the entire knowledge, you will never get the success, you know. That's what happens right now in Russia, where all military knowledge is linked to one person, because Putin makes all military decisions, okay? Subduing his own generals, and some of them are wrecked with stupid decisions, because he thinks about himself as the big general, okay? And this scholar wrote, to assume all the knowledge to be given to a single mind is to disregard everything that is important and significant in the real world, unquote. So look up on Google who was this scholar, read this article, and come to your own conclusions. Thank you for your attention.